I never thought I'd find myself sitting in a dimly lit workshop surrounded by a dozen half-finished puppets, the smell of wood glue and paint thick in the air, while some guy the first just met asked me if I wanted to try being handled. And no, this isn't the setup to a weird joke or some strange indie movie plot. I'm serious. So here's how it went down. I'd moved to the city about 6 months ago, mostly on a whim, chasing a fresh start after a breakup that left me feeling like I'd run out of good ideas. New city, new job, new coffee shops to pretend to write in. The usual. I stumbled upon this tiny puppet theater tucked away on a side street during one of my aimless Sunday strolls, because, apparently, I enjoy walking into random places these days. They were advertising some workshop, but it was sold out, which was a bummer. Still, I poked my head in anyway. That's where I met Max. He was the man behind the puppets, the guy everyone in that neighborhood talked about when they weren't busy wondering if he was some kind of eccentric genius or just a really intense weirdo. Tall, slim, messy dark hair that looked like he hadn't bothered with a comb since the tone 90s, and these green eyes that were sharp but kind of hypnotic when he was talking about his craft. I overheard him explaining the mechanics of a marionette to a couple of curious visitors, and something about the way he described giving life to inanimate things was captivating. After the crowd thinned out, he caught me watching one of his puppets, a delicate-looking figure with chipped paint and strings hanging like fragile veins, and asked if I wanted to see how it worked. I nodded, more out of politeness than anything, but then he surprised me. "Want to try being handled?" I blinked, thinking I'd misheard because, obviously, who offers a stranger to be controlled like a puppet? But Max just grinned, a mischievous spark lighting up his eyes, and said, "Come on, it's fun, I promise. It's like dancing, but someone else leads." I hesitated. There's something unnerving and oddly intimate about the idea of surrendering control to a stranger, especially one whose whole job was literally pulling your strings. But then again, maybe that was exactly what I needed, a break from always being in charge of my own mess. Before I knew it, I was standing in the middle of his workshop, tangled in strings and wooden sticks, trying not to look too ridiculous as Max pulled the levers that made me flop and sway like a marionette. It was awkward and hilarious, and I probably looked like a fool, but Max was laughing, the kind of genuine, easy laughter that made me want to stick around. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about puppets or weird hobbies. There was something different about Max. Something real. But just as I was starting to get comfortable being handled, Max's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes darkening as if he was wrestling with something he wasn't ready to say. Then he asked almost quietly, "Ever thought about what it's like to let someone else really take the lead? Not just in puppetry." I swallowed hard. I wanted to say yes, but I didn't know if I was ready for what that really meant. Not yet. Still, somehow I knew this was the start of something I wasn't going to forget. I hesitated, trying to sort through the jumble of thoughts spinning in my head. I guess. I don't know. The truth was, I'd spent a lot of years trying to keep control over everything. My job, my relationships, even my own feelings. I thought that was the safest way to not get hurt. But sitting there, tangled in strings in a workshop full of puppets, the idea of handing over control to someone else suddenly felt less scary and more tempting. Max studied me for a second, like he was trying to figure out if I was joking or really considering it. Then he nodded, as if he'd come to a decision himself. Good. Because sometimes, the best way to find yourself is by letting someone else guide you. It's not about losing control, it's about trust. It sounded poetic, almost too perfect for a guy who spent his days making little wooden puppets. But there was something in his voice that made me want to believe him. That night, as I walked home through the quiet streets, I kept replaying his words. Trust. Letting go. It felt like a crack in the armor I'd spent years building. And honestly, the idea both terrified and thrilled me. The next day, I showed up at the workshop again, this time on purpose. Max was already there, surrounded by puppets in various stages of completion, wearing his usual messy grin. He didn't ask why I was back. He just handed me a cup of coffee and said, "Ready to really give this a shot?" "Yeah, I said, even though my stomach twisted with nerves. He led me to a small room at the back filled with mirrors and soft lighting. "Today's different," he said. "You're not just a puppet. You're a partner. We move together." I swallowed hard. This wasn't just about strings anymore. It was about connection. He began to demonstrate, his hands steady as he moved the wooden marionette with a grace that made it seem alive. Then he held out the controls to me. "Your turn." Taking the sticks, I felt awkward at first, jerky and unsure. Max guided me gently, correcting my grip, adjusting the tension in the strings. Suddenly, the puppet's movements smoothed out. It was like we were figuring each other out without speaking. Then, without warning, Max reached for my hands, placing them over his on the controls. "Now, feel it," he said softly. "Let me move you. Trust me." My heart raced. I felt the weight of his touch, the warmth of his skin, and the subtle pressure as he began to guide my arms. It was strange, surreal. I was literally letting someone else move me, shape my actions. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else. Safe. Intimate. We moved like that for a while. Bodies slowly sinking, the boundaries between puppeteer and puppet blurring. I felt a rush of adrenaline and something deeper, a connection that was hard to put into words but impossible to ignore. When he finally let go, I was breathless and laughing, the tension from months of loneliness melting away. Max looked at me with those piercing green eyes and said, "You're a natural." I shook my head, still grinning. "I don't know about that, but I'm definitely hooked." Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn back to that workshop again and again. Max and I spent hours tinkering with puppets. But more importantly, we explored this strange dynamic between us, playful, respectful, and charged with something I hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, after a particularly long session, where I'd been practicing moving a complex marionette, Max invited me to sit down with him for a drink in the tiny cafe attached to the theater. The place was cozy, with old mismatched furniture and walls covered in faded posters from past performances. We shared stories about our lives. Me about my messy breakup and search for something real. Him about growing up in a family of artists and how puppetry was his way of making sense of the world. At some point, the conversation shifted to control and vulnerability. "It's funny," Max said, swirling his coffee. "Most people think being handled means being weak or submissive. But it's the opposite. It takes courage to let someone in, to trust them enough to follow their lead." I nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "I guess I'm still learning how to do that." He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that made my chest tighten. "Maybe we can learn together." Something between us changed that night. The playful teasing and light touches grew softer, more deliberate. I caught myself looking at him differently, like maybe this wasn't just about puppets anymore. A week later, Max invited me to help with a new show he was working on. The theme was about control and freedom, power and surrender. I was nervous but excited. He handed me a puppet and said, "Tonight, you trust me." As I stood on the small stage, strings in hand, with Max beside me guiding the movements, I realized that this strange, beautiful dance of trust was something I wanted more of. And honestly, I was ready to be handled. The night of the show, I was a mess of nerves and excitement. Max had been working nonstop, tweaking puppets, rehearsing moves, and rehearsing lines for his own narration. The small theater was packed with an audience that felt both distant and close at the same time, like a crowd of strangers you're about to perform something deeply personal for. Max pulled me aside just before we went on. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low, almost teasing. I shrugged, trying not to admit my stomach was doing backflips. "As ready as I'll ever be," he smiled, that same slow smile from our late-night cafe talks, and nodded toward the puppet in my hands. "Remember, it's not about forcing control. It's about listening, feeling the rhythm. Trust me, I'm right here." Standing behind the curtain, I glanced out at the sea of faces. The lights dimmed, and the opening notes of soft music filled the room. Max stepped up, arms raised, and began manipulating the puppets with a precision that was almost hypnotic. When my cue came, I took the controls, the puppet, an elegant figure dressed in tattered silk, began to move under my hands, though awkwardly at first. Then Max's hands found mine again, guiding, coaxing, shifting the weight until my movements became smoother, more natural. Something clicked. I wasn't just controlling the puppet anymore. I was sharing this space, this moment, with Max. The strings pulled tight, not like a trap, but like a connection, a line between us. The audience was silent, watching the dance unfold. The story was simple, about surrender and freedom, about giving up control to find something more. I felt my heart racing, not because of stage fright, but because I was living the story. When we took our final bow, the applause was thunderous, and Max gave me a look that was equal parts pride and something deeper, something like relief. That backstage, we collapsed onto a worn-out couch, breathless and laughing. I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the spotlight. Max turned to me, eyes softer now. "You did amazing." "Seriously?" "Thanks," I said, feeling a little shy under his gaze. I don't think I ever realized how freeing it could be to let go like that. He nodded. "It's a kind of trust you don't find every day, in puppetry or in life." We sat there for a moment, the noise of the audience muffled behind the curtain. And then, unexpectedly, Max leaned in, his forehead resting lightly against mine. "Want to grab a drink?" he whispered. I hesitated for only a second before nodding. The night air was cool as we walked down the street toward a quiet bar Max liked. The way he moved, calm and easy, made me feel like I was finally settling into a rhythm I'd been missing. At the bar, we ordered something simple, sat close, and talked about everything and nothing, until the place emptied out. At one point, Max reached out, his fingers brushing mine on the tabletop. "You're different," he said quietly. "Not just because you let me handle you like a puppet. You're open, vulnerable, and that's rare." I swallowed, not sure what to say. It was the first time anyone had ever described me like that, and it scared me a little, but also made me feel seen. "I'm scared, Max," I admitted. "I've been so used to controlling everything that letting go feels like stepping off a cliff without knowing if there's a net." He smiled, eyes warm. "That's exactly what it is. But sometimes, the net is the person holding the strings." The idea settled in my mind, comforting and strange all at once. Over the next few weeks, our friendship deepened into something neither of us tried to label right away. We'd spend afternoons in the workshop, Max teaching me more about puppetry, while our conversations wandered into the territory of dreams and fears, hopes, and past heartbreaks. One rainy evening, I showed up soaked and frustrated after a long, shitty day at work. Max just listened as I vented, then said, "You know, sometimes the best way to deal is to hand over your strings for a while. Let someone else carry the weight." I laughed, the sound shaky. "You and your puppets," he grinned. "Hey, they're good teachers." He pulled out a new puppet, this one's smaller and less complicated, and set it in my hands. "Try it. I'll guide you." As I let myself be moved again, I felt the knot of tension inside me loosen, just a little. It wasn't magic, just trust. Two people willing to be vulnerable in front of each other. Weeks turned into months, and I started to realize that Max wasn't just the guy who designed puppets or taught me to move like one. He was the person who helped me see that control wasn't everything, that sometimes being handled didn't mean weakness, it meant connection. One night after we'd closed up the workshop, Max surprised me. He took my hand, fingers intertwining with mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Want to try something?" he asked. I grinned, feeling a thrill run through me. "Always." He led me over to a marionette that looked remarkably like me. Messy hair, skeptical eyes, awkward smile. Max handed me the controls and took mine in turn, guiding me as we moved together. "You're my favorite puppet," he said softly, the words making my chest tighten in the best way. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't scared to be handled, because I knew who was holding the strings. That night, as I stood there tangled in strings and Max's steady hands guiding mine, I felt this strange clarity wash over me. It wasn't just about the puppets anymore. It was about us, how two people, each carrying their own scars and fears, could find a rhythm together. We moved slowly, deliberately, the marionette mimicking every subtle shift in our combined touch. Max's breath was warm against my ear as he murmured, "You're letting go. I'm proud of you." I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it stuck. Saying those words out loud, letting go, felt like admitting I'd been holding my breath for years. When the puppet came to rest, Max didn't pull away. Instead, he reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair from my forehead. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing." There was something vulnerable in that moment, something raw. I wanted to tell him everything, the doubts, the loneliness, the way I'd been wired to keep control at all costs. But instead, I just nodded, letting the silence hold what words couldn't. For days after, I found myself replaying that moment in my head, feeling the pull between us like a string stretched tight but ready to snap into something new. One afternoon, Max invited me over to his place. His apartment was a reflection of his workshop, artsy and a bit cluttered, with puppet parts and sketches scattered across the space. He brewed coffee as we talked about the upcoming season's performances, but there was an undercurrent to the conversation I couldn't ignore. Then, without warning, Max reached out and caught my hand in his. "I want to ask you something," he said quietly. I looked up, heart pounding. "Yeah? Would you consider being more than just my puppet partner? I mean, us." He gave me a nervous smile, like he was afraid I'd laugh or run away. I blinked. It felt like the ground shifted beneath me, but this time, it wasn't scary. It was exhilarating. "I'd like that," I said honestly. "More than anything." He grinned, relief washing over his face. "Good, because I've been handling these feelings for a while now, and I'm ready to stop pretending they're just part of the job." We laughed, a little awkwardly, but it was the kind of laugh that breaks down walls. That night, as I left his apartment, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I wasn't just following strings. I was holding them too. Our relationship built slowly, like the puppets Max crafted. We learned each other's rhythms, strengths, and fears. We had our awkward moments. The first time he kissed me, fumbling over words and feelings, the evenings when I doubted if I was ready to be this open. But every time, Max was there, steady and patient, pulling me back when I drifted away. One rainy evening, we were curled up in his workshop, the sound of water tapping against the windows. Max was working on a new puppet, and I was running my fingers along the strings, feeling the tension. "I never thought I'd meet someone who could handle me," I admitted softly. Max looked up, eyes shining. "You'd be surprised how many people are scared of trusting, but not you," I smiled, leaning into him. "I guess I'm learning that being handled isn't the same as being controlled. It's about trust." He kissed the top of my head. "Exactly." Months later, we put on a new show together, our story woven into the puppetry. It was raw and honest, a dance of vulnerability and connection that left the audience breathless. After the final bow, as the crowd cheered, Max squeezed my hand and whispered, "We're not just puppets on strings, you know. We're the hands that guide each other." And in that moment, I knew I had found something worth letting go for. A love that didn't need perfect control, just open hearts willing to move together. After that show, things between Max and me felt like they were shifting into something deeper, something that didn't need the safety net of puppets or strings to hold us together. We were still tangled in those metaphors sometimes, laughing about how I'd gone from stiff and awkward to moving with a kind of fluid trust. But now it was more than a dance. We were figuring out how to live side by side. One Sunday afternoon, we found ourselves sprawled out on the threadbare couch in Max's apartment, the city noises muffled behind the thick windows. The light was soft, filtering through half-closed blinds, casting stripes on the floor. The kind of quiet that feels like a pause in the middle of a chaotic day. "I was thinking," Max said, rolling a mug of coffee between his hands, "maybe we should start building a puppet that's just for us. Something that tells our story." I looked up, intrigued. "Like a couple's puppet? How would that even work?" he grinned, eyes sparkling with that familiar creative fire. We could design it so the two halves move separately, but connect somehow, like a metaphor for what we've got. Independent, but linked. I laughed, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. That sounds kind of amazing. And terrifying. Like, what if it falls apart? That's the point, he said seriously. Nothing perfect lasts, but the effort, that's what matters. So we started. Late nights soldering tiny joints, carving delicate faces, debating colors and strings. There were frustrating moments like when a limb broke off or the paint smeared, but somehow those little failures made the process feel more real, more us. One night, while we were hunched over the half-finished puppet, Max suddenly paused and looked up at me. Do you ever think about the future? Like, beyond these strings, the shows, all this? I hesitated. It was a question I'd skirted around since we started. The idea of planning something lasting was both exciting and terrifying. Yeah, I do. Sometimes it scares me, though, he nodded slowly. Me too. But then I think about how we've already been through so much, letting go, trusting, and maybe that's the foundation we need. I reached out, running my fingers along the puppet's wooden frame. I want that. To figure it out with you. Max smiled, the kind of smile that makes you believe in something you didn't dare hope for. Over the next few weeks, we started spending more time outside the workshop. We'd grab coffee at weird little cafes, explore the city's hidden corners, and sometimes just sit in Max's living room, talking until our voices grew hoarse. One evening, after dinner, Max pulled out an old photo album he'd found at a flea market. We flipped through pages filled with pictures of puppets, shows, and faces I hadn't seen before. Max's family, his childhood, the people who shaped him. Here, he said, handing me a picture of a younger version of himself holding a puppet that looked a lot like one of his first creations. This was the start, a way to make sense of things. I looked at the photo, then back at Max. Thank you for letting me in, for trusting me. He shrugged, a little shy. I think we're building something new. Together. That night, as I walked home under a sky smeared with stars, I felt something shift inside me. The fear that had kept me so guarded was still there, sure, but it was quieter now, replaced by something that felt like hope. A couple of weeks later, Max surprised me with tickets to a theater festival on the outskirts of the city. The place was rustic, with strings of fairy lights hanging between trees and the scent of wood smoke in the air. We spent the day watching performances, talking about what inspired us, and dreaming aloud. As dusk settled, Max took my hand, his fingers warm and familiar. I want to keep learning how to move with you, he said softly, not just on stage, but in life. I squeezed his hand back, heart pounding. Me too. The festival's final act was a puppet show unlike any I'd seen. Complex, emotional, and messy in the best way. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And as I watched it unfold, I thought about how far I'd come, from a guy who'd been afraid to let go, to someone willing to be handled, and to handle in return. After the show, Max and I sat together on a fallen log, the night wrapping around us like a blanket. He leaned into me, voice low. I don't want to be just the guy who pulls your strings. I want to be the guy who holds your heart. I swallowed hard. I think you already are. He smiled, that slow, tender smile that made all the noise in the world fade away. We sat there for a while, just breathing, just being. Two people who found each other in a tangle of strings and trust, ready to take the next step, together. After that night at the festival, something between Max and me settled into a new rhythm, quieter but deeper. It was like stepping off a carousel and onto solid ground. Still a little dizzy, but steady enough to take the next steps. We'd grown used to the workshop's chaotic charm, the way the puppets mirrored our own fumbling attempts at connection. But now, I could feel this growing sense that what we had wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was real. One Saturday, a week after the festival, Max surprised me by dragging me out of bed early. "Come on," he said, grinning like he'd won some secret prize. I have plans. I was half asleep, wrapped in a blanket, and suspicious, but I knew better than to argue. So I threw on some clothes, grabbed my keys, and followed him out into the chill morning. We hopped on his old bike, the one with the slightly bent handlebar that made steering a little unpredictable, and headed for the river that cut through the city. The sky was the kind of pale blue that hints at spring, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and new beginnings. I didn't ask where we were going because Max's mysterious plans had always turned out better than anything I could have dreamed up. When we reached the riverbank, Max pulled out a small wooden box, worn but carefully carved. "I've been working on something," he said, eyes twinkling. "Wanna see?" I nodded, curious despite the chill biting at my fingers. He opened the box to reveal two tiny marionettes, each no bigger than my palm. One looked like a miniature version of me. The other was unmistakably Max, a little puppet with wild hair and a mischievous grin. "They're us," he said softly. "Our puppet selves." I couldn't help but laugh. "You really are a romantic," he shrugged, looking a little sheepish. "Maybe, but I wanted a way to hold this, us, in my hands. To remember how far we've come." I reached into the box, carefully taking the tiny me, feeling the delicate strings and wood under my fingertips. The idea that these little figures were a symbol of what we were building, trust, vulnerability, connection, hit me harder than I expected. Max watched me with that patient, tender gaze that always seemed to see right through my bullshit. "Do you trust me?" he asked, voice low. I smiled, not hesitating this time. "Yeah, I trust you." He picked up the other puppet and placed them side by side on the grass. Then, with the care of a craftsman, he began to move their strings, making them dance together in a slow, imperfect waltz. The tiny figures swayed and dipped, a fragile choreography of two people learning to move as one. That day by the river, under a sky that was just starting to blush with the promise of sunrise, I realized that trust isn't about never falling. It's about knowing someone is there to catch you and willing to hold the strings when you can't. In the weeks that followed, Max and I fell into a comfortable routine: workshops, rehearsals, lazy mornings with too much coffee and not enough sleep. We talked about everything from silly puppet jokes to serious life stuff, like what it meant to build a future when both of us had been burned before. One evening, as we were packing up the workshop after a long day, Max suddenly paused, his hand still on a half-finished puppet. "Hey," he said, looking at me with that familiar mix of nervousness and hope. "I've been thinking maybe it's time we take this to the next level. Like, officially." I blinked, caught off guard. "You mean us? Like boyfriend and boyfriend?" He laughed, a little nervous. "Yeah, if you want. I just don't want to keep dancing around it." I felt a warmth spread through me, the kind that loosens the tight grip of old fears. "I want that. I want you." He grinned, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "Good, because I'm terrible at subtlety." We celebrated that night with bad takeout and a marathon of old movies, laughter filling the small space between us. But as the months rolled on, life threw its usual curveballs. Work stress hit me hard. Max struggled with family stuff he hadn't told me about yet. There were days when the strings felt too tangled, and we both questioned if we were strong enough to keep pulling them together. One afternoon, after a particularly rough argument, I found myself sitting alone in the workshop, running my hands over a puppet I'd been working on. The silence was heavy, and I felt the ache of uncertainty creeping in. Was trust enough? Could love really survive the messiness of real life? Just then, Max's voice broke through the quiet. "Hey." He stepped inside, eyes soft, but determined. "I'm sorry," he said bluntly. "I hate when we fight like that." "Me too," I admitted, the tension in my chest easing a bit. He walked over, closing the distance between us. "We're not perfect, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we just need to keep trying. Together." I looked up at him, the weight of months of fear and doubt lifting just a little. "Together," I echoed. And that night, as we sat tangled in each other's arms, I realized love wasn't about flawless control or never making mistakes. It was about holding on, even when the strings got messy, trusting that the person beside you would never let go. In the weeks that followed, Max and I found a new balance. Not perfect, but ours. We learned to navigate the rough patches without losing sight of what brought us together. The strings that once felt like constraints became symbols of connection, reminders that even when life pulled us in different directions, we were still tied together by trust. One evening, after a long day of rehearsals, Max surprised me by setting up the workshop with soft candles and quiet music, the kind of simple, thoughtful gesture that meant more than any grand gesture ever could. He handed me that little wooden box with our miniature puppets inside, their strings carefully untangled. "We've come a long way," he said softly, "and I couldn't have done it without you." I smiled, feeling my chest tighten in that familiar good way. "Neither could I. You've taught me what it means to let go and still be safe." We moved together then, gently guiding those tiny figures through their slow dance, each motion deliberate and full of meaning. It was a quiet celebration of everything we'd built: hesitations, mistakes, laughter, and love. Later, as Max pulled me close, I realized that surrendering control wasn't about weakness at all. It was about courage. The courage to be vulnerable, to trust someone else with your heart, and to hold theirs in return. That night, lying beside him with the city lights twinkling outside the window, I finally understood what it meant to be truly handled. Not as a puppet, but as a partner, and that, more than anything, was worth every string.